Of all the places she could have moved, Denise never imagined her new neighbor would make her question everything about her dream home. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet suburban street where the lawns were always trimmed, the mail always delivered on time, and the neighbors waved from their porches with friendly smiles. But that wasn't the welcome Denise got. No, the first thing she heard when she stepped out of her moving van was, "Oh, great. Just what this neighborhood needs." The voice belonged to Claire, a woman with a sharp tongue and a sharper glare. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, with a look that could curdle milk. Denise, trying to stay polite, smiled and waved. But Claire didn't wave back. Instead, she turned on her heel and muttered something under her breath loud enough for Denise to catch the words, "Wrong kind of people." At first, Denise tried to ignore it. After all, she'd dealt with difficult people before. She chalked it up to Claire having a bad day. But as the weeks passed, the comments didn't stop. They escalated, whether it was snide remarks about Denise's guests, accusations about noise that didn't exist, or the constant glare of Claire's eyes watching her every move. It was clear this wasn't just an unpleasant neighbor. Claire had decided Denise didn't belong, and she was determined to make her feel it. But Denise wasn't one to back down easily. She knew there was no winning someone like Claire over with kindness alone, yet she kept her head high. Her mother had always taught her, dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. So Denise did her best to keep peace. That is, until one day when Claire's actions crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and Denise had planned a small get-together with some friends. Nothing fancy, just a backyard barbecue. But as soon as her guests began arriving, so did the trouble. Claire stormed out of her house, phone in hand, and began filming. "Look at this," she shouted loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is what's ruining our neighborhood, people who don't respect where they live." Denise froze. Her friends glanced at one another, unsure of how to react. Claire's accusations continued, becoming louder, more hostile, and more personal. It wasn't just about noise or parking anymore. Her words dripped with something darker, something unmistakable. And then came the moment no one expected. As Claire went on about how people like Denise didn't belong, a voice called out from behind the crowd, "Excuse me, ma'am, but do you even know who you're talking to?" A hush fell over the yard as everyone turned toward the man who had spoken. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a quiet authority. Denise's friends immediately recognized him and stood a little straighter. Claire, oblivious to the tension, snapped back, "I don't care who she is. People like her have no business." "That's enough," the man said, stepping forward. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that made people listen. He turned to Claire and said, "I think you should know, you're talking to the mayor of this city." Claire's face went pale. "The mayor?" she stammered, glancing between Denise and the man. "Yes, the mayor confirmed. And I've heard more than enough about how you've been treating her." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. The confident, self-righteous neighbor who had spent weeks making Denise's life difficult suddenly seemed very small. The crowd was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. And that's where the story really begins. Because what happened after that day wasn't just about one confrontation or one neighborhood feud. It became a story about accountability, change, and the power of standing up to prejudice in all its forms. What do you think happened next? Did Claire learn her lesson? Did Denise finally get the peace she deserved? Stick around because you're about to find out just how far kindness, courage, and a little bit of justice can go in changing not just a street, but a mindset. For a moment, nobody moved. Claire's face was frozen in a mix of shock and confusion. The words mayor of this city hung in the air like a fog no one could escape. Denise felt a flicker of vindication, but it was drowned out by the tension of the moment. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted this kind of confrontation in front of her friends, her neighbors, or anyone else. She'd wanted a quiet, normal life. But it seemed that Claire had other plans. The mayor, whose name was Jonathan Parker, stepped closer to Claire. His calm demeanor made his presence even more commanding. "I don't think you understand the gravity of your actions," he said, his voice low but deliberate. "I've known Denise for years. She's not just your neighbor. She's an upstanding citizen and a valued member of this community." Denise wanted to say something, to take control of the situation, but Jonathan's presence seemed to have shifted the dynamic completely. For the first time, Claire wasn't in charge. And yet, despite everything, Denise couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. Claire didn't seem like the kind of person to back down easily, even when she was clearly in the wrong. Finally, Claire spoke. I didn't mean anything by it," she said, her voice unsteady. "I was just concerned about the neighborhood. That's all." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Concerned about the neighborhood," he repeated, his tone making it clear he wasn't buying her excuse. "And what exactly about Denise and her friends has you so concerned?" Claire hesitated. Her face flushed red, and she avoided looking directly at him. "I just thought, you know, the noise, the cars. It's a quiet street. I didn't want things to get out of hand." Denise finally found her voice. "Out of hand?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "Claire, this is the first time I've had people over since I moved in. I've been nothing but respectful to everyone here, including you. If you have an issue with me, at least be honest about what it is." Claire's eyes darted to Denise, then back to Jonathan, as if searching for an escape route. "I don't have an issue with you," she said quickly. I just want what's best for the neighborhood." Jonathan sighed, his disappointment evident. "Claire, this isn't about the neighborhood," he said. "This is about you making assumptions and judgments about someone you barely know. And I'll be honest with you, it's not a good look." Claire's face crumpled slightly, but she said nothing. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jonathan turned to Denise and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't deserve this," he said softly. "No one does." Denise nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't used to having someone stand up for her like this, and she wasn't sure how to process the mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief, gratitude, anger. It was all there, tangled together. As the awkward silence stretched on, Claire finally muttered, "I'm sorry." The words were quiet and grudging, barely more than a whisper, but they were enough to break the spell. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I hope you mean that," he said. "Because this neighborhood should be a place where everyone feels welcome, not where they're made to feel like outsiders." With that, he turned back to Denise. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out," he said. "You've got more support here than you think." Denise managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said. "Really." Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod before addressing the group. "All right, everyone, let's get back to enjoying the day," he said, his tone lighter now. "This is supposed to be a barbecue, isn't it?" The crowd began to disperse, though the atmosphere was still charged with the weight of what had just happened. Claire retreated to her house without another word, her earlier confidence shattered. Denise watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Part of her was relieved that someone had finally put Claire in her place, but another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As the afternoon went on, Denise tried to enjoy the company of her friends, but the incident with Claire lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but wonder what had driven Claire to act the way she did. Was it just prejudice? Or was there something deeper, something more complicated? Later that evening, as Denise sat on her porch watching the sunset, she noticed a shadow moving in the window of Claire's house. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass before Claire quickly turned away. Denise sighed, leaning back in her chair. Whatever Claire's problem was, it wasn't going to be solved overnight. But Denise wasn't the type to give up easily. She'd dealt with people like Claire before, people who let fear and ignorance dictate their actions. And while she didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel unwelcome in her own home. Little did she know, though, that this was just the beginning. The events of that day would set off a chain reaction that would change not only her relationship with Claire, but the entire neighborhood as well. Because sometimes the hardest lessons aren't learned in a single moment. They're learned over time, through challenges, growth, and the unexpected ways people can surprise you, for better or worse. Denise didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Denise woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had been hard to come by after the events of the barbecue. As much as she wanted to shake off the confrontation with Claire, the woman's behavior had left an imprint. Every time Denise closed her eyes, she saw Claire's face, red with embarrassment, but also defiant, as though she still believed she'd done nothing wrong. Denise pushed the thought aside and decided to focus on her day. She had a list of errands to run, and she wasn't about to let Claire's negativity consume her time or energy. As she walked out to her car, she noticed something unusual. A note was tucked under her windshield wiper. For a moment, her heart sank. She wondered if it was another passive-aggressive message from Claire, but as she unfolded the paper, she saw it wasn't handwritten. It was typed, the words printed neatly in bold letters. "Don't let people like her get to you. You're not alone in this neighborhood." Denise blinked, rereading the note. Her first instinct was suspicion. Was this some kind of joke? But the tone seemed genuine. She looked around the street, but it was quiet, the early hour keeping most people inside. Whoever had left the note clearly didn't want to be known. Still, the gesture warmed her heart. Maybe Jonathan was right. Maybe there was more support around her than she realized. By mid-afternoon, Denise found herself at the local community center, where she'd volunteered to help with an upcoming charity event. The center was buzzing with activity, and the familiar hum of friendly chatter helped lift her spirits. As she set up tables with another volunteer named Rosa, Denise shared the story of the barbecue and the mysterious note. "Claire," Rosa asked, her eyebrows shooting up. "You're talking about the woman who lives 2 houses down from you, right? Short, always wearing those big sunglasses." Denise nodded. "That's her." Rosa shook her head. "She's been like that for years, always finding someone to pick on. Last year, it was the couple on the corner because they painted their door a color she didn't like. Before that, she was on a crusade against the kids who skate in the cul-de-sac. It's like she has nothing better to do." Denise frowned. Has anyone ever called her out on it before? "Not like what happened at your barbecue," Rosa said with a chuckle. "I heard about that, by the way. News travels fast around here." Denise sighed. "I didn't want to make a scene. But I'm not sorry it happened. She needed to be called out." "You were not wrong," Rosa said, "but don't expect her to change overnight. People like her don't just wake up one day and realize they've been wrong." That thought stayed with Denise as she drove home later that evening. She didn't expect Claire to apologize again or to suddenly become friendly. But part of her couldn't help wondering why Claire was the way she was. What had happened in her life to make her so bitter, so quick to judge? A few days later, Denise got her first glimpse of an answer. She was returning home from a morning walk when she saw Claire in her front yard. The woman was crouched over a patch of weeds, pulling them aggressively from the flower bed. Her movements were sharp, almost angry, and Denise noticed something she hadn't before, a slight limp in Claire's walk as she moved to grab a garden bag. It was subtle but noticeable, and it made Denise pause. She debated saying something. Part of her wanted to just keep walking and avoid another confrontation. But something about the way Claire moved, the tension in her shoulders, stopped her. "Hey," Denise called out, her voice tentative. Claire looked up, startled. For a moment, her face hardened, but then she seemed to catch herself. "What?" she asked, her tone clipped. Denise hesitated, then gestured to the flower bed. "Your garden's looking nice." Claire squinted at her, clearly suspicious. "What do you want?" Denise shrugged, just being neighborly. Claire snorted, shaking her head. Funny, considering what happened the other day. Denise decided to ignore the comment. "Do you need help with those weeds?" she offered. "I've got gloves at home. It wouldn't take long." Claire stared at her as though she'd just suggested something absurd. "I don't need your help," she said, her tone sharp. But Denise didn't miss the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. "All right," Denise said simply. "Well, let me know if you change your mind." She walked away, unsure if she made any progress or just wasted her breath. But as she glanced back over her shoulder, she saw Claire watching her, a strange expression on her face, somewhere between confusion and something else Denise couldn't quite place. That evening, Denise called her best friend, Mia, to talk things over. It's like Mia was silent for a moment before replying. "I get what you're saying, Denise. But just be careful, okay? Some people aren't ready to change, and you don't need to drain yourself trying to fix them." "I know," Denise said. "But what if she's not as bad as she seems? What if there's more to her story?" The next day, Denise found herself baking. It was something she often did to clear her head, and before long, her kitchen was filled with the smell of warm cinnamon and sugar. As she pulled a batch of muffins from the oven, an idea struck her. It was probably foolish, but something told her it was worth a shot. She placed the muffins in a basket, wrapped them in a clean dish towel, and walked over to Claire's house. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Denise thought no one would answer. But then the door opened a crack, and Claire's face appeared, wary and confused. "What do you want?" Claire asked, her tone guarded. "I made these," Denise said, holding up the basket. "I thought you might like some." Claire stared at the muffins, then at Denise as though trying to figure out what kind of trick this was. "Why?" she asked flatly. Denise smiled. "Because it's what neighbors do." Claire hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. She took the basket without a word, her expression unreadable. "Thanks," she muttered before closing the door. As Denise walked back to her house, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd just wasted her time. But something about the way Claire had taken the basket, hesitant, almost reluctant, gave her a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step towards something better. But Claire wasn't the only one with secrets, and as the days passed, Denise began to notice strange things happening around the neighborhood. Small, seemingly insignificant events that didn't add up. A car she didn't recognize parked outside Claire's house late at night. Whispers among neighbors about an argument Claire had with someone on the phone. And then there was the envelope that appeared in Denise's mailbox, unmarked and containing only a single piece of paper with the words, "Be careful who you trust." The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit yet, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. The mysterious note in Denise's mailbox weighed heavily on her mind. Who Who could have sent it, and what did it mean? Be careful who you trust. The words echoed in her thoughts as she went about her day, trying to act normal even as a gnawing unease settled in her chest. She thought about Jonathan, the mayor, and how quickly he had stepped in to defend her. Could someone have seen that as a threat? Or was it tied to Claire's sudden shift in behavior? None of it made sense. Over the next few days, Denise noticed that Claire had become oddly quiet. Gone were the glares from her porch and the passive-aggressive comments muttered under her breath. Instead, she kept her distance, almost as if she were avoiding Denise altogether. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, it only made the situation feel more unsettling. Claire wasn't the type to back down easily, so why now? One evening, as Denise was locking up her house for the night, she caught sight of movement across the street. A man she didn't recognize was standing outside Claire's house, speaking to her in hushed tones. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and kept glancing around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Claire seemed agitated, gesturing with her hands and speaking quickly. Denise couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension between them was clear. She watched from behind her curtains as the man handed Claire a small envelope. Claire took it reluctantly, her shoulders stiff, and shoved it into the pocket of her cardigan. The man nodded, said something else, and walked briskly down the street toward a car parked at the corner. Denise's heart raced as she watched the headlights disappear into the night. The next morning, Denise decided she couldn't let her curiosity simmer any longer. She needed answers, even if it meant risking another confrontation with Claire. As she walked over to Claire's house, she rehearsed what she would say in her head. Maybe she could frame it as concern, and offer of help if Claire needed it. But as she reached the porch, she hesitated. The blinds on the front window were drawn tightly, and the house seemed unusually quiet. Denise knocked lightly on the door, then waited. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as she was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open slightly. Claire peeked out, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted past Denise, scanning the street behind her, before finally settling on her face. "What do you want?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to check on you," Denise said carefully. "You've seemed different lately." Denise hesitated. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if something's wrong—" "Nothing's wrong," Claire snapped, cutting her off. Her voice was sharp, but there was something behind it, fear. "Just leave me alone." The door closed with a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. Denise stood on the porch for a moment, her stomach twisting with unease. Whatever was going on, it was more than just a neighborhood feud. Claire was hiding something, and it was clear she didn't want Denise, or anyone else, getting involved. That night, Denise lay awake, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. The man at Claire's house, the note in her mailbox, the strange tension that had settled over the neighborhood. It all felt connected, but she couldn't piece together how. She thought about calling Jonathan, but something held her back. What if she was overreacting? What if it really was none of her business? But then, just as she was starting to drift off, a loud crash jolted her awake. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. Another crash followed, this time louder, and she realized it was coming from outside. Throwing on a robe, she rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain. Her stomach dropped. Smoke was billowing from Claire's backyard, and the faint flicker of flames danced against the darkness. Without thinking, Denise grabbed her phone and dialed 911 as she ran out the door. The cool night air hit her face as she sprinted across the street, shouting Claire's name. "Claire, Claire, are you in there?" There was no response. Denise banged on the front door, but it was locked. She tried peering through the windows, but the thick smoke made it impossible to see inside. Panic surged through her as she realized she didn't know if Claire was even home, or worse, if she was trapped. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a flicker of hope. Within minutes, the fire department arrived, their trucks screeching to a halt in front of the house. Firefighters moved with practiced efficiency, breaking down the door and charging inside. Denise stood on the sidewalk, her hands trembling as she watched the scene unfold. After what felt like an eternity, one of the firefighters emerged, leading a coughing and visibly shaken Claire out of the house. She clung to him, her face streaked with soot and her eyes wide with terror. Denise felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The way Claire's eyes darted around, the way she flinched at every sound, it was clear this wasn't just about the fire. Something else had her terrified. As the firefighters worked to contain the flames, Denise approached Claire cautiously. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Claire didn't respond at first. She just stared at the ground, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket someone had draped over her shoulders. Finally, she looked up, and the raw fear in her eyes made Denise's breath catch. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know it would go this far." "What do you mean?" Denise asked, her heart pounding. "What's going on?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, one of the firefighters approached. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions," he said, directing Claire toward one of the trucks. Denise watched as Claire walked away, her mind racing with unanswered questions. What had Claire meant by "I didn't know it would go this far"? And who was responsible for what had just happened? As the night wore on, Denise couldn't shake the feeling that the fire hadn't been an accident. Whatever secrets Claire was hiding, they were dangerous. And now Denise was caught in the middle of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. As the firefighters packed up their equipment and the flames finally dwindled, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet murmurs. People had gathered outside, their faces lit with concern and curiosity. But Denise couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts were consumed by Claire's cryptic words and the nagging sense that none of this was an accident. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed tightly, trying to make sense of it all. Claire sat slumped on the back bumper of an ambulance, clutching a bottle of water in her shaky hands. Her face was pale, her usual sharp demeanor replaced with something that looked almost like defeat. Denise wanted to approach her, to press for answers. But the firefighter still questioning Claire made it clear this wasn't the time. Denise turned to head back home, the night's chill finally starting to seep into her skin, when a voice stopped her. "You might want to be careful getting involved with her." Denise spun around to find Rosa, her fellow volunteer from the community center, standing just a few steps behind her. Rosa's face was grim, her arms folded as she watched the scene unfold. "What do you mean?" Denise asked, lowering her voice. Rosa glanced around, her eyes darting to the gathered neighbors before she leaned in closer. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything before, but Claire's trouble. And I don't just mean her attitude. There's talk around town that she's mixed up with some bad people. Dead, shady deals, things that can get ugly fast." Denise frowned, her stomach twisting. Why would she? Does it matter why? Rosa interrupted. "The point is, people like that bring their mess with them. And now that mess is spilling out into the neighborhood." Denise opened her mouth to respond, but stopped short as another detail came back to her. The man she'd seen at Claire's house just days ago, handing her that envelope. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was Claire being threatened? Was she involved in something illegal? The pieces of the puzzle were growing more sinister, but they still didn't fit together. The next morning, Denise woke to the sound of voices outside her house. She peeked through the blinds and saw two men in dark suits standing on Claire's porch. They didn't look like neighbors or repair workers. There was something official about them, something that made Denise's pulse quicken. She watched as Claire, looking disheveled and visibly stressed, stepped onto the porch to meet them. The conversation was tense. Even from a distance, Denise could see the tight lines of Claire's mouth and the way her arms crossed defensively. As soon as the men left, Denise made up her mind. She grabbed her jacket and headed across the street. If Claire wouldn't talk to her willingly, Denise would find a way to get answers. But just as she was about to knock, the door swung open, and Claire stood there glaring. "What do you want now?" Claire demanded, her voice hoarse. Denise hesitated, then spoke firmly. "I saw those men. Who are they, Claire? And what's really going on here?" Claire sighed, her shoulders slumping. For a moment, Denise thought she might finally open up, but then her face hardened. "It's none of your business," she snapped. "Just stay out of it." "Stay out of what?" Denise pressed. "Your house nearly went up in flames last night, Claire. Whatever this is, it's not just your problem anymore." For a split second, something flickered in Claire's eyes, fear, guilt, or maybe even regret. But she shook her head. "You don't know what you're talking about," she muttered before shutting the door in Denise's face. Frustrated but undeterred, Denise decided she needed to dig deeper. She reached out to Jonathan later that day, recounting everything that had happened. Jonathan listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with every detail. "Do you think the fire was intentional?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "I don't know," Denise admitted. "But Claire's acting like she's hiding something. And those men this morning, they weren't there to check on her well-being." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "Let me make a few calls," he said. "If there's something going on, we need to know what it is. And if she's in danger, we need to figure out how to help." As Jonathan left, Denise felt a small sense of relief. At least now she wasn't carrying the weight of this alone. But that relief was short-lived. Later that evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was short and chilling. "You're asking too many questions. Stop, or you'll regret it." Denise froze, her hand tightening around the phone. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, as if someone might be watching her even now. Who had sent the message? And how did they know she'd been asking questions? She forwarded the message to Jonathan immediately, her fingers trembling as she typed. A reply came quickly. "Don't panic. I'll handle it. Just stay safe and lock your doors." Denise double-checked every lock in the house that night, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for her next move. Whatever Claire was involved in, it was bigger than Denise had imagined, and now she was in the thick of it. The following day, the neighborhood seemed eerily quiet. Denise avoided Claire's house entirely, not wanting to push her luck, but she couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. It wasn't until she stopped by the community center to pick up some paperwork for an event that she got her next shock. Rosa pulled her aside, her expression tense. "You need to be careful," she said in a hushed tone. "I heard some things, rumors about those men who were at Claire's house. They're not just debt collectors. They work for someone powerful, someone who doesn't like loose ends." "Loose ends," Denise repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Rosa nodded grimly. "If Claire owes them, they're not going to just let her walk away. And if they think you're getting involved..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Denise's stomach turned as she realized just how dangerous the situation had become. This wasn't just about Claire's choices or her past. It was about survival. And somehow, Denise had become a part of it. But the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. Who were these men? And what did they want from Claire? And more importantly, how far would they go to get it? The tension in the neighborhood reached its peak when Denise saw Claire's house surrounded by unmarked cars the following evening. Men in suits were standing outside, speaking urgently into radios, while others moved briskly in and out of the house. Denise watched from her window, her heart racing. This wasn't just about debt collectors anymore. It looked official, but not in a reassuring way. The street was unusually quiet, neighbors retreating indoors, sensing that whatever was happening was bigger than them. Just as Denise was debating whether to call Jonathan, her phone buzzed. It was him. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "I just got off a call. There's a lot more to this than we thought, and it's not safe." Denise's stomach churned. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Jonathan hesitated before answering, his tone unusually serious. "Those men aren't who they seem. They're part of a task force investigating a criminal ring in Claire. She's their key witness. But she's been playing both sides, and now it's all unraveling." The words hit Denise like a punch to the gut. Key witness? Criminal ring? It was almost too much to process. "Are you saying she's involved with criminals?" "She's not innocent," Jonathan admitted. "But it's complicated. She's been feeding information to the authorities to save herself, but it looks like the people she's dealing with found out." As if on cue, the sound of raised voices carried through the quiet night. Denise peeked out the window and saw Claire being escorted out of her house by 2 agents. Her face was pale, her eyes darting wildly as she argued with them. The scene felt surreal, a collision of the mundane suburban life Denise thought she knew and the dangerous world lurking beneath it. Unable to stay silent any longer, Denise threw on a coat and stepped outside. She approached cautiously, her eyes locked on Claire. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Claire stopped mid-argument and looked at Denise, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, Claire looked vulnerable, almost pleading. "I didn't want this," she said softly. "I didn't have a choice." "Ms. Walker, we need to go," one of the agents interrupted, his tone curt. But Claire didn't move. Instead, she turned to Denise, her voice shaking. "You have to understand, I thought I could fix it. I thought I could get out before it was too late." "Fix what?" Denise demanded, her frustration boiling over. "What did you do?" Claire hesitated, then finally confessed. "I got caught up in something I couldn't control. I owed money, more than I could ever pay back. They said they'd forgive the debt if I helped them. At first, it was just small things. Watching people, passing along information. But then they wanted more. And when I tried to back out, they threatened me." Denise's heart sank as the pieces finally clicked into place. Claire's strange behavior, the mysterious man with the envelope, the fire, it was all connected. But before she could respond, one of the agents stepped forward. "Ms. Walker, enough," he said firmly. "We need to secure you now. The people you're dealing with won't stop." As they led Claire away, Denise's mind raced. If Claire had been playing both sides, then the fire wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a message. And if those people thought Claire had betrayed them, the danger wasn't over. Hours later, Denise sat in her living room, the weight of the night pressing down on her. She was startled by a knock at the door. Her first instinct was fear, but when she looked through the peephole, she saw Jonathan standing there, his face somber. "We've got a problem," he said as she let him in. Claire's testimony was supposed to be their trump card, but now it's falling apart. She admitted she destroyed some of the evidence they needed to protect herself. The people she's dealing with, they're not going to take this lying down. Denise stared at him, her pulse quickening. So what happens now? Jonathan hesitated, then pulled a small device from his pocket. I got this from someone on the task force. It's a recording Claire made weeks ago, before everything went south. She names names, gives details, but she never handed it over. If they find out this exists. He trailed off, but Denise understood the implication. That recording was a ticking time bomb, and now it was in their hands. As Jonathan played a snippet of the audio, Claire's voice filled the room, trembling but clear. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she said. "If something happens to me, this is the truth. They need to know." Denise felt a chill run down her spine. The stakes had just skyrocketed. Claire's words might expose a dangerous network, but it also painted a target on anyone who had the recording. The final twist hit Denise hard. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of this, whether she liked it or not. The weight of what Jonathan had just revealed pressed heavily on Denise's chest. The recording wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a lifeline and a liability all at once. She could feel the gravity of the situation deep in her bones. Claire's voice echoed in her mind, raw and desperate, and Denise couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The neighborhood, her life, everything she had built, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of a precipice. Jonathan placed the device gently on the table, his expression somber. "This isn't just evidence, Denise," he said quietly. "It's a map to everything. Names, operations, the whole network. If it gets into the wrong hands." "It can't," Denise interrupted, her voice firm but low. "We can't let it. But what do we do with it? How do we protect it? And ourselves?" Jonathan hesitated, glancing at the door as though he expected someone to burst through at any moment. "I've already contacted someone I trust. They'll get this to the authorities, but we need to be smart. The people Claire was involved with won't stop until they're sure this evidence is destroyed." Denise nodded, her resolve solidifying. "We can't let them win. Claire made a mess, but this can't end with more fear and more destruction. If this recording is the key to stopping them, we have to make sure it's used." Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod. "That's the plan. But we have to be ready for the fallout. These people don't give up easily." The next few days passed in a tense blur. Denise kept her routine as normal as possible, though her every move felt calculated and heavy. She caught glimpses of unmarked cars on the street, people watching from corners, and even her usually mundane walks to the mailbox felt like steps into danger. Jonathan stayed close, keeping her updated on every small development. The recording was now in safe hands, on its way to a secure location where it would be reviewed and used as evidence against the network Claire had been tangled in. But the fallout came sooner than expected. Late one evening, as Denise was settling in with a cup of tea, a loud bang echoed through her quiet street. She rushed to the window and saw a car speeding off, its tires screeching against the pavement. Her heart raced as she realized it had come from Claire's house, or what was left of it. Flames licked at the sides of the house, smoke billowing into the night sky. It was a final act of destruction, a message that no loose ends would be tolerated. Denise grabbed her phone and called 911, her hands shaking. The firefighters arrived quickly, but the damage was done. Claire's home was a charred shell by the time the flames were extinguished. Jonathan arrived shortly after, his face grim. "They're making their move," he said. This was a warning. Denise felt a mix of fear and anger bubbling inside her. They think they can scare us into silence. But they're wrong. We won't let this go. The next few days were a whirlwind. The authorities moved swiftly, using the recording to launch a series of coordinated raids. The network Claire had been entangled with was larger than anyone had anticipated, but the evidence she provided was enough to dismantle key operations. Arrests were made, and slowly the neighborhood began to feel a little less suffocating. But Claire wasn't there to see it. After being taken into protective custody, she had disappeared from view. Jonathan suspected she had been moved to a safe location, possibly under witness protection. Denise thought about her often, wondering if she would ever fully escape the choices she had made. For all her faults and mistakes, Claire had ultimately done the right thing, even if it had come at a great cost. The neighborhood began to heal in small, gradual ways. The sight of Claire's burned-out house was a reminder of everything that had happened, but it also became a